today, last time we talked about Africa and kind of what was going on in Africa prior to the coming of the age of exploration. So we were looking primarily at Africa as it was going through its golden age. And as we concluded doing a survey across the entire continent, most of the various empires and peoples of Africa were doing really good in the 1300s. That the golden age, well, it was the whole medieval period. Really, by the 1300s, the big explorers, the big kings, were all running really strong in Africa. And yet we don't talk about these empires much today, and we're really going to focus in on today as to what happens that changes the world. And really it starts with the Portuguese Empire. So today we're going to talk about Portugal. In 1415, Portugal sparked a colonial enterprise that would transform the small nation into an empire. It fueled dynamic leadership and religious zealotry, really fueled the age of exploration out of Portugal. And so we're going to look at what the Portuguese did to bring about the modern world today. Once again, this is based primarily, Africa's golden age is a great precursor to this discussion, and I give a lot more different talks on modern Europe and the modern world, the development of the modern world. Some of those talks include Gunpowder Empires, which focuses on Islam during this period, or the era of pike and shot, which looks at European warfare. There's only so much we can delve into within an hour-long talk, so this talk is meant to focus specifically on Portugal and on its innovations and exploration, so not the broader world, as it were. Okay. So to start with, we have to understand what medieval Portugal was. So medieval Portugal, or the Portuguese in general, represent a mix of Gaelic, Latin, Germanic, and Arabic peoples and cultures. So most of the Iberian Peninsula, the area that includes Spain and Portugal, was conquered by Islam in at the end of late antiquity or the early Middle Ages. Portugal was reconquered and was established as a Catholic kingdom, independent from Castile and Aragon, which are the two big other Latin countries or kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula during the Middle Ages. Because Portugal kind of hugs the Atlantic coast, it's primarily the nation kind of developed along the lines of seafaring. Primarily fishing and shipping along the North Atlantic. And they were ruled by a dynasty known as the House of Aviz, which has strong dynastic ties to the Kingdom of England. And in fact, the man who really can be seen as, he's not the first king of Portugal, but certainly the man who kind of gave Portugal its independence long term was a king by the name of John the First, or João, and I'm sorry if I'm not fluent in Portuguese, so I'm going to butcher these names. But John the First was king during the early 1400s. He would die in 1433, but his big claim to fame is that he beat Castile in the Battle of Arjubarata in 1585. With the support of England, the Portuguese and the English beat Castile in the battle and secured Portuguese independence. And with the back of his country protected from other Christian kingdoms, he starts to focus in on dealing with the slave trade and the slave raiders operating in North Africa. Now, as we talked about last time, slavery is endemic throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Middle Ages, and you really need slaves to man galleys, to man ships in the Mediterranean. And for the Islamic kingdoms, the black Africans in Central Africa were an ideal workforce. They were extremely hard to get to. You had to ship them over the Saharan desert. It was very, very difficult. It was much, much easier to go up and take your ships up to Europe, pull off on the coast, and just grab every Christian person you could in the village. Cities specifically in the Maghreb or the Morocco region really prospered from this sort of piracy. In fact, all of North Africa really prospered from this sort of piracy. So they would literally, sail up to Sicily, grab as many Sicilians as they could, or into Majorca, or into southern France, or a lot of the times the Iberian Peninsula, and they would just grab all the Latin-speaking peoples they could, and they hauled them away to the slave markets in cities such as Ceuta. The Portuguese are fed up with these raids. In 1415, King Zhao launches a punitive campaign against the city of Ceuta. And it's led by one of his younger sons, a man by the name of Prince Henrique. You can see in this tile mural here. He leads the attack in 1415. In addition to just attacking Ceuta, he actually conquers it. And so the port is really great because it gives the Portuguese access to. At any rate, Henry, really distinguishes himself in the battle. He gets injured, but he fights back, and he kind of gets really interested in Africa. This is his big claim to fame, and he learns very quickly after conquering Ceuta about the sub-Saharan gold trade. He learns also that there are Christian black Africans somewhere in the interior, led by Prester John. All the things that we talked about in the golden age of Africa. Henrique becomes not only aware of these things, but extraordinarily interested. And he believes that his claim to fame is going to be that the key to Portugal's success lies in Africa. Also, as a result of his conquest, he's made Grand Master of the Military Order of Christ in 1420, which is the military order of the crusading order in Portugal. And he believes that the future lies pretty much in bypassing the Islamic trade monopolies and reaching the fabled Christian king. So Henry starts to sponsor state-sponsored exploration of the west coast of Africa. And within a few years, so within 3 years of conquering Ceuta, which you can see on that map, the Portuguese have reached Madeira, then the Azores, then Cape Bojador, the Senegal River, Cape Verde, and Sierra Leone. By 1452, before Henry passes away, the influx of gold from West African trade, primarily along the Senegal River, allows Portugal for the first time to mint its own coins. So Portugal is not only a nation, it's a financially, it's becoming a much more viable financial nation in medieval Europe. A lot of this exploration is done because Henry pushes a revolution in maritime design for European vessels. The Portuguese develop under Henry, the caravel. So Henry doesn't develop it himself. He's not an engineer, but he pays and he keeps improving. He wants his ships improved upon and improved upon. And these ships are usually between 40 and 60 feet in length and an average of 50 to 60 tons. They adopt a lateen sail, which allows you to sail into the wind, and a shallow keel, which enables you to take these boats up rivers and along shorelines. You can hug the coast with these boats because you don't have to worry so much about reefs because they don't sit too deep in the water. So if you don't have good maritime charts, this boat's ideal because it can get into a lot of places that your bigger boats can't. And in the development of this caravel really leads to the development of two other larger ships. One is the carack, which is used for cargo, and the galleon, which is a warship. And all these are developed kind of simultaneously. As the Portuguese also move into these islands and along the west coast of Africa, they acquire lands that are really poor for the regular European role of agriculture. They try doing some grain and some wheat production in Madeira. It's terrible. However, many of the explorers who are largely Venetian and Italian explorers performing this work for Portugal, they mention that the environment seems very similar to what's used in the Eastern Mediterranean for the production of sugar. And in 1455, the Portuguese bring in Sicilian engineers to copy a sugar mill design from the Eastern Mediterranean. And they begin to import African slaves to the colony to supplement the local indigenous people. So they have, in essence, a plantation system developed by 1455 in the island of Madeira. And by 1480, Madeira, I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing that right, has surpassed the Crusader Kingdom of Cyprus, become the primary sugar producer in all of Europe. And the model is then transferred by the Portuguese to all of their colonies. So Portugal is now the primary exporter of sugar to Europe in 1480. Henry dies in 1460, so he sees some of his ambitions take light in his lifetime, but not all of them. When he dies in 1460, Portugal is poised to enter the Gulf of Guinea, which is that first kind of curve in Africa's geography. And unfortunately for the Portuguese and for Henry, he believes this is literally the turning point to getting to Prester John, and this is going to be direct contact with Asia, passing all the Islamic states, and it seems very possible. However, what they realize as they get into the Guinea current is that unfortunately the continent is not only much bigger than they want, but they're tacking against the wind. So it's very hard to sail east from the Guinea coast into Africa. They're able to do it with the caravel, but it's much slower and harder, and the continent is much larger than they thought it was. We'll come back to these currents and these wind streams in a couple minutes. That being said, by 1483, a Portuguese explorer by the name of Diogo Cao sails up the Congo River in search of Prester John. He doesn't find him, but what he finds is the pagan kingdom of Congo. And this is a very large state, and it's a state that is aware of Christianity and Islam, certainly. They're aware of God, but they're pagan. And he decides to bring back a deli. In fact, these people had been, unfortunately, preyed on by the Islamic kingdom around Lake Chad for years prior to the coming of the Europeans. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Asia of these Congo peoples back to Portugal. There this congregation meets with the Portuguese court and then eventually converts to Catholicism. They also return to the Congo in 1485, so 2 years later, telling the king of the Congo, a man by the name of Manikongo Nzinga Nkui, about all the glories of Christianity, the glories of the Portuguese court. And Manikongo, the king, decides to be baptized and takes the name King John I in honor of the Portuguese king. From that point forward, the Congo becomes the first client kingdom of Portugal and the chief exporter of African slaves to all Portuguese colonies. As great a success as converting the Congo people is to Christianity, it's a great win that these people are now Catholic. They try a bold plan 2 years later in 1487. They still haven't found Prester John, and they need to find him. So they send two different expeditions in 1487. The first one is a group of spies, which they tell to go through the Middle East and find Prester John. If the Muslims know where he is, you just go through their territory until you find him. And they send on these spies are Pero de Colvilla and Afonso de Pava. Pava dies en route, but Colvilla doesn't return, so they don't know what happens to him. At the same time, they send this overland expedition. They send an explorer by the name of Bartolomeu Diaz further south in Africa. And in 1488, he sails around the Cape of Good Hope, which he actually named the Cape of Storms. So he doesn't give it as good of a name as you think. It's a pretty terrible place. The result of this 1488 exploration is that it proves without a shadow of a doubt that the Indian Ocean is not landlocked. There is a way to India. They don't get to India in 1488, but they know they're very close. They know they've rounded the tip. The same year, somebody else in 1488, he was actually there in 1485. So he's there both when the good news of the Congo had been, and there when Diaz returns to say that he's rounded the Cape of Good Hope. There's a crazy guy in the Portuguese court. So the Portuguese are doing all of this exploration, and all the explorers primarily from Italy and from Renaissance Italy, are flocking to the court and trying to get these exploration these grants to explore different areas. And there's one guy by the name of Christopher Columbus who arrives in Portugal and pitches his idea. Columbus believes that the world is smaller than everybody thinks. And he's wrong. He's absolutely wrong. But he believes that because the world is much smaller than everybody thinks, he thinks the quickest way to Asia is sailing west, sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. You don't have to go around Africa. You simply have to sail west and you'll hit Asia. Portugal rejects this initiative. They believe contact with Asia via Africa is imminent and that Columbus's calculations are wrong. And they're right on both accounts. Columbus was absolutely wrong. You could not, the world was as large as the Portuguese thought it was. The idea of sailing west to Asia was it was economically not feasible. It's also very likely that the Portuguese were already aware that the Americas existed and stood between Asia and Europe. Now that seems like a bold claim, but it's really not a bold claim. Many historians have pointed that there's great circumstantial evidence for this for many, many years. We'll talk about what some of that circumstantial evidence is. So when we don't have direct proof, we're pretty sure. And really, the Portuguese have been conducting all these explorations in secret. So nobody knows what the Portuguese have found. It's not like the other European nations at this point know about the Kingdom of Congo. It's not like they understand what's going on, how far the Portuguese have gotten in Africa. The Portuguese are playing everything tight-lipped. But Columbus gets brushed off by the Portuguese, and he goes and pitches his idea to Spain, which then finances it. And Columbus goes out he ends up landing in the Caribbean islands. And he comes back in 1492 with the bold assertion that he reached India and claimed the land for Spain. The Portuguese, with science, mathematics, and their knowledge on their side, take offense to this claim that Columbus can claim that India has been claimed for Spain. Portuguese know damn well that he hasn't found India, but they don't want to go to war with Spain. Remember, Spain is who they traditionally fought to maintain their independence. And going to war over a few small islands is just not worth it. They are confident Columbus is wrong, so they go to the Pope. They appeal to the Pope, and the result is the Treaty of Tordesillas. So in 1494, and later reaffirmed in the Treaty of Saragossa in 1529, the Pope carves up the world of influence. And if you'll see here, the modern globe it's kind of carved up. You'll notice that the Portuguese claim all that based upon the lines of cutting up the world. Columbus is getting Spain's getting most of the Americas, the area where Columbus thinks Asia is. But Portugal's getting the area which includes all of Asia and Africa, or most of Asia, other than for some of the Pacific islands, in a portion of Siberia in the north. Portugal's claiming the area where they're pretty positive Asia is, and they're claiming the area which is the eastern portions of Brazil. Now, technically, if we go off just fact, the written record, Brazil hasn't been discovered yet, but the Portuguese kind of fight for the areas they want. And if you'll notice that originally Pope Alexander wants to give them a little bit less, and the Portuguese are like, nah, we want a little bit more than that. And we'll go clearly that they probably know that Brazil is actually there when they claim this area. The Treaty of Tordesillas is a diplomatic win for Portugal as it gave them Africa and Asia. And the treaty, a lot is made of the treaty, but it's obvious that most of the other European powers ignore the treaties. It's a diplomatic win for Portugal with Spain. It really isn't a win overall. And the reason the Portuguese want these areas they have is since the 1480s, they've been experimenting with deep sea travel. So once you pass the true magic of the Portuguese naval system is they realized the way to get around Africa was not to hug the coast. It was to sail out. Columbus was sort of right. You had to sail out into the Atlantic Ocean to reach India. However, what you were following is something known as the South Atlantic Gyre. And this wind pattern will rocket you out to the west, but it'll eventually go west and then south, and then it'll eventually swing you east. And if you rocket out on that current, you can kind of bypass India. So the key to sailing around Africa is to go west, but it's not like Columbus thought. You don't just go directly west and hit Asia. You hit this current and you swing on that current around the Cape of Good Hope and over to India. It's likely that during this time they may have learned about the Americas. If you'll notice, to swing out on that Atlantic gyre, you pretty much end up on the coast of Brazil. So getting around Africa requires you to pretty much sail to Brazil. And this is the route, only 4 years later, that Vasco da Gama will use to reach India in 1498. So literally 4 years after they get the Treaty of Tordesillas, they're in India. Now, Vasco da Gama is a fairly interesting guy. Like most of these explorers, he is actually a crusader. He's a knight of St. James or Santiago. In his voyage in 1497, between 1497 and 1499, Gama discovers both the Arabic East Africa, so he ends up on the eastern coast of Africa, and Central Asia, leading to the colonies of Mozambique and India for Portugal. He secures the spice trade, especially cinnamon and pepper, for Portugal. And he was actually given the title of Admiral of the Seas of Arabia, Persia, India, and all of the Orient. So a great explorer, probably the person we should be elevating to the status of Grand Explorer rather than Christopher Columbus. A really brilliant man who not only cracked the code, but was able to do what no European had done before. With the intention. He literally set out to find India, and he did, as opposed to Columbus, who made some bad math calculations and stumbled upon a people that he believed until his dying day were Indians, and obviously that's led to all problems that we have in Americas today. So the Portuguese arrive in India, and almost instantly, they unfortunately, they mistake the Hindu people as Christians and instantly make war on the Muslim states along the northwest coast. In 1509, the Portuguese fleets would engage the Ottomans, Venetians, and their allies at the Battle of Du and pretty much establish Portuguese authority over the entire Indian Ocean. Now, it might seem weird. I just said Venetians. The Venetians were operating the Indian Ocean. They had actually allied with the Ottoman Turks and were profiting from the trade across the Indian Ocean. So trade that went through the Ottoman Empire. So the Venetians would operate in India. They would get their stuff through customs. The Ottomans would take a cut, and the Venetians would then get it back to Europe and sell it to people at a huge cost. The Portuguese destroy all of this, and they established their capital at Goa in 1510. This is one of the early Catholic churches built in India. I don't remember the name off the top of my head. But India then will serve as the base of expansion west into the Persian Gulf and east into the Pacific Ocean. Interestingly enough, the Portuguese actually arrived before the quintessential Indians. So it's important to note that while the Portuguese are outsiders, always viewed as foreigners, the Mughals, who build the Taj Mahal, that give India most of its quintessential Indian characteristics, actually come later than the Portuguese. So the Mughals don't even arrive till 1526, and the focus on the Ottomans and Mughals is really the Gunpowder Empire. The Mughals were not necessarily rivals at most of the time with the Portuguese, establishing their hold in northern India in the interior, as opposed to the Portuguese that stay on the coast. But it's interesting. If I put up a picture of the Taj Mahal, you would say that, oh, that's quintessential Indian. That's India in a nutshell. Yet I put up this Catholic church and you say that doesn't belong there. And yet that church is older than the Taj Mahal, and the Portuguese were in India before the Mughals were, who built the Taj. Marshalling Mozambique. In addition to operations in India, I said that da Gama actually explored along the east coast of Africa. The Portuguese established a naval base at Mozambique Island in 1507, so very early on. This is to control trade along the East African coast. Mozambique would become one of Portugal's more notorious colonies. By the 1530s, traders and gold prospectors are moving further inland along the Zambezi River. The Portuguese establish a kind of almost like the Spanish land grant system, the Prazo system, and a plantation system is soon established along the Zambezi. What makes Mozambique probably the most strange of all Portuguese colonies, it was almost conquered entirely by large African slave armies. So they took their African slaves, and the Portuguese did try to conquer inland on their own, but every expedition they sent would die of disease. They really cracked the code in the sense that they realized that if they armed their African slaves and sent them inland to conquer land for them, these tended to work very good, and they ended up destroying most of the interior kingdoms of southern and central East Africa. In fact, as we talked about last time, the Shona peoples lived inland. Zimbabwe was gone at this point. The Shona people were still living in that general area, the areas of present-day Zimbabwe. These people actually, the Shona called these African armies Chikunda, these slave armies. They viewed these enslaved Africans that came up with weapons as Chikunda, which roughly translated means conquistador. So they viewed conquistadors not as Europeans armed with rifles and riding horses and destroying their way of life, but rather the large numbers of African slave communities that the Portuguese in Mozambique marshaled and equipped, that then conquered the areas and developed the colony. So when was Brazil discovered? Well, technically, Brazil was discovered on April 22nd, 1500. Unlike most explorations, so explorations with either Christopher Columbus or something like that, usually you have a very small number of people discover something. You don't risk hundreds of lives discovering something that may or may not be there. A lot of times discoveries are accidental. However, that's not the case with Brazil. On April 22nd, 1500, Portuguese landed an army in Brazil. It was an army that they were getting ready to go to India, but Cabral just literally brought the army and just landed it there and said, all these lands are ours. They sit within the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's our land. That's not usually how things are discovered. So it's very likely that it wasn't discovered. It was likely that it was just officially claimed on April 22nd, 1500. The Portuguese landed their army. Originally, they didn't know what to do with Brazil. They started the colony hoping to harvest Brazil wood, but it really wasn't very profitable, and they eventually just transitioned into African labor in the plantation system. The natives in Brazil died very quickly. It was just easier, especially given the ocean currents. They could easily get slaves imported from the Guinea coast and from the Congo area. They could easily get them over to Brazil. It was a very quick trip because you're not fighting the ocean currents or the winds, the prevailing winds. You just arrive there, no problem, and you're able to establish a very large colony very quickly that's profitable, very profitable. They also established some colonies in Canada, which most people don't know about. Interestingly enough, the first mention of Canada is in 1473, or appears to be in 1473. Now you ask yourself, oh God, that's a long time before Columbus discovered America. Yeah, it is. There's issues with the reference. We're not entirely sure what he's referencing, but a man by the name of João Vaz Cortel Real says he reaches Terra Nova de Bacalhau, which has been translated as Newfoundland of the codfish in 1473. We're not sure if he actually reached Newfoundland, but interestingly enough, his sons, his heirs actually are credited with mapping Greenland and Labrador in 1500 and 1501. So while 1473, if it was being done, they were keeping it quiet. The Portuguese officially discovered Greenland and Labrador, which is part of modern day Canada, in 1500. Once again, it's right after that Treaty of Tordesillas. And Labrador was actually first discovered by, it was given the name by John Fernandez de Labrador visited there in 1499, but it wasn't officially mapped and discovered until 1501. The Portuguese decide that the best way to manage Canada is that the colony should be profitable by levying taxes on cod fishing. And they established the colony of St. John in Canada around 1521. Once again, it's not really profitable. Fishing, while valuable, is nowhere near as valuable as sugar as a commodity. And eventually, the North American colonies just given up. And most of those colonists probably migrate to Brazil, focus on colonial enterprises in Brazil. So short-term Portuguese colonization in North America. But if you'll notice, that colonization is happening prior to Cortez getting to mainland North America. So we're talking about an area where the Portuguese are in North America in 1506. Cortez won't get to Mexico until 1519, very, very early dates. And in fact, St. John is actually contemporaneous with the conquest of the Aztec Empire. Okay, the Portuguese are also heading east. They don't set up any large colonies, but instead focus on trade ports. They're at Malacca in Malaysia in 1511. They're in Indonesia by 1522. They're in Macau, which is pretty close to present modern-day Hong Kong, in China by 1557. And they're in Nagasaki, Japan by 1571. In fact, they get to Japan much earlier. They set up their trade port at Nagasaki in 1571. These trades are bringing in huge amounts of spices, porcelain, silk, and slaves, are taken in exchange for firearms, silver, and other trade goods. People tend not to think of the Portuguese in the Far East, but they're definitely there. We see this even in Chinese and Japanese art. This man is obviously, he's got a little monkey, probably like a little macaque, and he's got obviously very European clothes and dress, even though it's rendered in Japanese style. And of course, the most famous, and the one I tell people, and I complain to my wife every time I go to a Japanese restaurant and I order tempura, as I say, you do know that this is really the inspiration for this. You know, if this seems out of place in a Japanese restaurant, it should. It's a Portuguese dish. It develops out of Portuguese. The Portuguese enter into Japan and they eat a heavy fritter during Quator Tempora, or Ember Days. And eventually that word is adopted by the Japanese and it becomes a lighter fried material. But tempura is actually Japanese tempura is really the result of Portuguese colonization and spread of maritime trade by the Portuguese in the 16th century. Okay, so we just went through very roughly, very quickly, what the Portuguese Empire looks like in rapid succession. I'm going to have to blast through a couple slides now. It's pretty widespread, but you'll notice it doesn't have a lot of land mass. Portuguese are not a very popular, there's not a lot of Portuguese people to begin with, but they're spread across the globe at this point. You can kind of see some of those different areas, as well as when some of those areas are actually lost. In the case of Mozambique and Rwanda, you know, you're talking about areas that were not, that have only not been Portuguese possessions for the last 50 years. Now, through this whole thing, they had not found Prester John. So here's the good news. The spy who'd been sent to find Prester John, he found him. In 1490, he ended up in Ethiopia, and he found Prester John, the great Ethiopian kingdom in the highlands. It wasn't a guy, you know, Prester John was neither a Prester nor was he a John. And in fact, the person he found was a woman, Queen Eleni, who was ruling the kingdom at the time. And the Portuguese never find her. She actually hears that the Portuguese are operating in the Indian Ocean, and she sends out a delegation to find the Portuguese. So the Ethiopians arrive in India and they say, "You were looking for us, here we are. And we brought you a gift. We brought you a fragment of the true cross." Portuguese are elated at this. The true cross is shipped back to Portugal. The fragment is sent back. Was it really a fragment of the true cross? I don't know. But the ultimate goal is in 1514, Ethiopia and Portugal signed their great defense agreement. Now, it's probably worth saying that the Portuguese were always holy warriors. They had been engaged in holy war against the Muslims since the early Middle Ages as part of the Reconquista. They have almost all the nobility, as we've kind of mentioned, all the big names that we talked about. They're all people, they're tied to crusading orders. And in fact, King Afonso V had received a papal bull in 1452, known as Dum de Versas, which authorized Portugal to conquer Saracens and pagans and consign them to perpetual servitude. What it was an excuse that Afonso was given so that he could engage in the slave trade. So the slave trade for the Portuguese was actually sanctioned by the Pope in Rome. And this gave them the authority to colonize Africa and do what they wanted with their plantations. And during this time period, this imperial expansion of the Portuguese, they take these oaths fairly seriously. These are religious zealots, and they attack Muslims just to attack Muslims. And in fact, some of the conquerors, the Duke of Albuquerque, for example, when he conquers Malacca, he says the Muslims are all to be killed, but you don't touch those Chinese people because they're good people. At the time, I don't think they understood what Buddhism was. But they knew that it wasn't Islam. They could recognize that much, and then they left him alone. But the Portuguese arrival in the East really sparks an arms race, and in the Horn of Africa, it goes wild. So the Portuguese fight. So the Ottoman Turks give all their Muslim allies lots and lots of weapons, and the Portuguese fill the Ethiopians with lots and lots of weapons. And the Portuguese take almost a kind of happiness in stopping Muslims from reaching Mecca. So they control access to the Red Sea, and they block them off, and they just destroy their ships by the hundreds. But for the cost of it, and these are mostly against the Somali peoples, so the Adal, Ajuran, and Wansalgi, Warsangali sultanates, which are all client kingdoms of the Ottoman Empire. But these wars don't win much. There isn't, as you'll realize today in our modern world, when we tend to talk about Somalia and in Ethiopia, we tend to talk about these areas that are incredibly poor and impoverished, and areas of great humanitarian disaster, primarily because the European nations don't want to get involved there because there's not a lot. There's not a lot there worth colonizing. And what the Portuguese do is spend a lot of resources fighting in the Horn of Africa. Destroying these what they would view as Somali pirates. They weren't really pirates. They were Muslim. I guess they'd be Ghazis or religious warriors. But it was very costly for Portugal. And these wars, these fights with the Muslims that they felt obligated to conduct, these wars against Islam, really lead to an overextension and an exhaustion for the Portuguese Empire. And by 1578, we enter into a period of crisis in which a series of disasters caused the near collapse of the empire. The first and probably most famous is the Battle of Albuquerque. It was fought on August 4th, 1578. A very small Portuguese army headed by the king, King Sebastian, lands in North Africa. They face off against a Moroccan force of the Saudi dynasty or Saudi Empire. And the Saudis are all, they're expecting these Muslims to be poorly armed and poorly organized. But the Ottoman Turks have really propped these guys up, given them modern firearms, giving them tactics. They don't have Janissaries per se, but they got good fighters amongst them. And the Portuguese army is pretty much surrounded and destroyed on the battlefield. You can see a picture of it here. The king dies on the battlefield, which in short work leads to a succession crisis. And there's three candidates for Portugal. Unfortunately, the first and the dreaded candidate is Philip II of Spain. His mother had been a Portuguese princess. He had a great claim for it. In fact, if he hadn't killed his son 2 years before, his son would even had a greater claim, because he married a cousin who was also a Portuguese princess. So his son was actually more Portuguese than he was Spanish. Unfortunately, that son was insane and tried to kill the Duke of Alba, and Philip just had to make him go away. Now, nobody knows for certain that Philip II killed his son, his first son, but even if he didn't kill him, he imprisoned them and brought about the conditions by which his death occurred. The other two people included Antonio, prior of Crato, and a woman who had married the Duke of Braganza, which we'll get to in a minute. But the reality is Spain was going to take it. And so Philip ordered the Duke of Alba to invade. This picture here shows the landing of the Spanish tercios, which we'll get into in a completely different talk on the air, pike and shot. This is the perfect formation. These are the great armies of Spain that never were conquered. For over 100 years, the tercios land, and they decisively crush all resistance. And Portugal enters into the Iberian Union, which is to say the King Philip II rules both Spain. He rules a lot of different things, but he rules Spain and Portugal under the House of Habsburg. The next tragedy, so that they lost at the battle in North Africa, and their army was destroyed. Then they were conquered by the Spanish. And then the next tragedy has more to do with the Spanish than it does with the Portuguese, but it negatively impacts the Portuguese. Philip II gets upset at Queen Elizabeth. She ends up killing a dear friend of his, the person he was hoping would become Queen of England, a queen by the name of Mary of Scots, Queen of Scots, was killed. Philip II is furious, and he sends his armada to invade England. His armada is not that big. And in fact, the entire armada is gathered at Lisbon, at the capital of Portugal. It's largely Portuguese ships. And the armada fights a battle at the Battle of Gravelines. In fact, the Portuguese fight themselves. So the Portuguese that were in Portugal fought for the side of Spain, while Antonio, the prior of Crato, was actually in England at the time. And the resistance, the Portuguese resistance, was located in England. So Sir Francis Drake, who led the assault for England at the Battle of Gravelines, was actually assisted by the Portuguese in exile, led by Antonio prior to Crato. And the disaster is that the battle's lost by the Portuguese. The Spanish lose, the ships retreat. You can see here, they lose the battle, but then they also end up, their entire fleet is destroyed. And within the course of only 10 years, Portugal is not only no longer a country, it has no king, well, it has Philip II, but it has no army, it has no navy, and it's now ruled by a foreign power. Now, there was some benefits to the Iberian Union. For example, the Portuguese and Spanish trade routes effectively connect the world. The problem is, without an army and a navy, these fleets which connect the world are largely undefended. They're moving all over the place with a lot of wealth. Rivals take advantage of this, primarily the English and the Dutch. They're aiding the Portuguese government in exile, and they begin their own campaigns of conquest and colonization. These actions are targeted at Spain. Remember, the Iberian Union, Portugal is under Philip II's authority, but Philip II views himself as a Castilian Spaniard. And the Dutch and English really hate the Spanish for a lot of reasons. I mean, technically, Philip II was their king of both nations. Philip II had been king of England under Bloody Mary, Elizabeth's sister. He technically ruled the Netherlands at this point, so the Dutch were actually his subjects. They really wanted to take things back. And so what you see here in rapid succession is the appearance of Dutch colonies throughout the East. But also the British are starting to move in as well. Both nations formed East and West India companies to compete with the Iberian trade monopolies. And ultimately, the struggle comes to a head for the Dutch under the 30 Years' War. You can see the last stand of the Spanish tercio at Rocroi. And if you don't know what the 30 Years' War is, think of it this way. It starts as a war between Catholics and Protestants, but it eventually merges into a dynastic struggle between the French House of Bourbon and the Spanish/German House of Habsburg. Pretty much, the Dutch caused the problem, and the Protestant Germans caused the problem. But when France realizes the Habsburgs are going to crush the Protestants and there's just no chance those guys are going to win, the French decide to protect the Protestants and finish off the war. The 30 Years' Wars resulted in pretty much 8 million deaths and the destruction of most of Germany. Germany is not going to recover for several hundred years. In effective rule of the Holy Roman Empire really wanes after the 30 Years' War. Meantime, as this is going on, I said there was another person who had a claim to the throne, a lady who married the Duke of Braganza. So the Infanta Catherine, Infanta means like princess, a Duchess of Braganza, had put forth a claim during the succession crisis, but she knew she didn't have any real strength to do anything about it. However, she was a direct descendant of the Aviz line. So even though she was a Braganza by marriage, her kids all had potentially a claim to the throne of Portugal. In 60 years later, so a long time later, her grandson actually takes the title of King John IV of Portugal, capitalizing on the anarchy of the 30 Years' War. So pretty much, and a rebellion in Catalonia. You'll find that as much as we tend to think of Spain as a united nation, the Catalans of Barcelona never really viewed themselves as Spanish. They viewed themselves as the Kingdom of Aragon. They viewed themselves as Catalans. They revolted. So Spain's dealing with the 30 Years' War, and all of a sudden, this ancestor of the Duchess says, hey, I have a claim to the throne. I'm the true king of Portugal, and he capitalizes on it. Here's the interesting thing, is while Spain has its back turned, all the Portuguese colonies recognize King John, with the exception of Ceuta, which is going to actually stay in Spanish hands, and they side with the House of Braganza. Moreover, France, who's fighting that 30 Years' War with Spain, decides to provide military aid, and later England does. And the real turning point in the Portuguese struggle for independence comes in 1662. King João pledges his and his daughter, the great-granddaughter of the Infanta Catherine, who's also named Catherine, Catherine of Braganza, marries King Charles II of England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Portuguese decide to give England, in pledge for military support, the ports of Bombay and Tangiers in England, as well as a large quantity of tea, which she introduces to a British subject. So if you're ever wondering where tea consumption comes from in England, why they started drinking tea, it's because of the Portuguese. The marriage secures the alliance in England with England, and the English decide to provide the military support the Portuguese need to gain independence. The Portuguese Restoration War lasts for about 28 years. And the interesting thing about the Restoration War, the reason the Restoration War is successful is the colony of Brazil. They provide key economic and military resources. They actually import an army from Brazil to fight the Spanish. And the decisive battle comes at Monte Claros on June 17, 1665, when the Portuguese, with the support of England, stop a major Spanish invasion force. So the Spanish try to reinvade, and they're stopped in their tracks. After the Restoration War, the Portuguese Empire is pretty much done. It enters into a period of slow decline. The House of Braganza will rule Portugal till 1910. The House of Braganza, believe it or not, during the Napoleonic era, secures Brazil's independence. So they actually make Brazil independent from Portugal, and members of the Braganza family will actually rule the Empire of Brazil till 1889. Most of the Portuguese colonies in Africa, including Mozambique, are lost in the 20th century to popular uprisings, resistance of the Portuguese. Today, the Azores and Madeira are autonomous regions held by Portugal to this day. So where do we go for a summary, a real quick summary? Well, it all started in Ceuta in 1415 under the very capable Prince Henrique. This colonial adventure would bring about the rise of plantations and monopolized trade in Asia and Africa. We still don't know the full extent of Portugal's discoveries because they were state-held secrets. A lot of the documents are likely lost to time. We just don't know what they found, what those guys experimenting with the South Atlantic gyre really realized, and how early they knew the Americas was there, or what they discovered that they didn't bother to talk about because it wasn't profitable for them at the time, or whatnot. But we're pretty sure they knew about the Americas before Columbus's voyage, or suspected it. These explorations led to Portugal administering a global empire that eventually got them into trouble. They overextended themselves, and a series of military disasters led to Portugal actually becoming part of the Spanish Empire. And it would only be restored after a lengthy war by the House of Braganza in 1668. So my conclusions are fairly simple. First and foremost, Portugal's contributions to the Age of Discovery without equal. If the Portuguese do not establish the plantation system, if they don't establish the ships, none of the European Age of Discovery even happens. The slave trade had been going on, but they are the ones who took really the focus on bringing slaves out of Africa to fuel their colonies. And this would be matched by all other European powers. And really the Portuguese, maybe more so than for the English and Dutch, they really provide the blueprint for success. So the Dutch Empire and the English Empire, the British Empire, really have the Portuguese to thank for their successes. They provided the model or blueprint. And with that, I think we're just about out of time, but I will open it up for questions. My voice is very sore at this point, but I'll do my best. And my email, as always, is listed there, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Cheryl asked if slaves had been taken to Greenland and Labrador.
I don't believe so. I mean, they may have been in small numbers, but you got to remember that the colony was actually focused on the taxation of fish. Okay. So really what they want is fishermen to have to stop at their bases in Canada to load up on supplies, and then they would count how many fish they got, and they tax them. It's not a plantation-based colony the way Brazil or Mozambique would be.
Okay. Another question from Ron Garcia is that you had mentioned the caravel ships were made to go upstream. Just curious, did the earlier Viking longboat have any influence on this design?
No, absolutely none. In fact, the inspiration for the caravel actually comes from wedding European naval designs with Arabic ones. So they actually take inspiration from the dhow, which is an Arabic ship, a much smaller Arabic ship, and the lateen sails are really coming from their influences in North Africa. They can't use a galley. The galleys of the Mediterranean, which, you know, the slaves and the rowing and stuff like that, you can't really use those for exploration on the Atlantic. You need a more robust ship than that. But those sails were really, really important. So they're not getting them from the Vikings. They're actually getting them from their enemies, the Islamic states.
Okay. And then lastly, does Portugal have any influence today in the EU?
I don't. I'm not a modern. I study the early modern era. I'm not a modern day politics kind of guy, so I don't know. My understanding is that Portugal nowadays is probably it's not the most well-to-do economic nation. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. One of the telling signs I think we can look at through looking at the early modern era is that by the time of the Restoration, the independence from Spain, Brazil was actually more important than the lands in Portugal. So it took Brazil's backing to free Portugal from Spain. In that case, Portugal had actually its colonies had already outgrown it by the 1600s. You could make the argument, I'm not saying I am, nor do I say that America is, but in many ways, America would outgrow its connections with England, but it still took, and I'm sure this is probably a harder view than most, it took America getting involved in even the First and Second World War to really save its former imperial nation that had once ruled it. You could look at the fact that Brazil's doing the same thing. They're returning to Europe. These colonists are returning to Europe to save their motherland, as it were.
Okay. And one last question is, Ron asks, what is the Spanish tercio?
That's an entirely different lecture. So the short answer is it depends upon who you ask. Some people believe that the tercio was developed as a nickname for the three Italies, and it comes out of the Italian Wars for sure. But really, what it appears to be, if we look at it from more of an academic standpoint, the tercio is the great military mind of Spain is not Cortez, it's Gonzalo de Cordoba. And he was a man who fought in the Italian Wars, and he ended up becoming viceroy of Sicily and Naples in the early 16th century. But what he developed is a unit which combined musketeers or arquebusiers, pikemen, and a sword and shield soldier. So these formations would include all three kinds of soldiers. And ideally, they would be a third pikeman, a third sword and buckler man, and a third arquebusier. The numbers actually change over time. And these regiments are usually tied to a specific place. So you'll get the Tercio of Seville, or you get the Tercio, or where their campaigns, the Tercio of Sicily. And these units, which are very large, about 1,000 men strong, work as coordinated whole. And these units, if properly placed on the battlefield, could overcome anything. So nobody, the mounted knight of Europe could not pierce the Tercio. These slow-moving formations would just walk across the battlefield, and they'd shoot their guns, and if it came to it, they'd perform the push of pike, which are these, they drop their pikes and they just slam into each other. Nobody ever came really close to beating the Tercio. What the French actually finally realized is that Spain was hurting for money, and they often didn't deploy these troops unless the conditions were absolutely perfect. So you just gradually wore down the Tercios. You didn't actually beat them in combat. I know a lot's made of the Prince of Orange, and of course Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. They never really beat the Tercios. In fact, it's almost like a foregone conclusion that if the Tercios arrived, you're done for a long period of time. In fact, that's what they thought would happen if Spanish armies had actually landed in England. They were bringing up the army from the Netherlands, which included the Tercios of Italy and Spain, their elite forces, and they were just going to mop the floor with the English. It didn't happen. There's a lot more to the developments of the Tercios and Gonzalo de Cordoba, but that's really a talk about Spanish history. The Portuguese did try to muster a sort of tercio, but it's not really the same, and it's not as prestigious as the Spanish equivalent.